All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a really deep dive into something I spend a lot of time analyzing from a social welfare perspective, and that is decoding the complex reality of poverty in a developing nation like India. Figuring out how a country of over a billion people tackles this issue, well, it's basically a masterclass in global economics and inequality. We're going to look at the definitions, the root causes, and the massive systemic solutions required to fight it on this huge scale. So if you've ever wondered how economists actually measure who is poor, you are definitely in the right place. But hey, before we get completely lost in the data and the charts, we really need to ground ourselves in the human element here. Poverty is fundamentally a condition where people just cannot meet their basic necessities. It is the literal inability to secure basic survival needs. It's a harsh daily reality for millions of people, and keeping that human focus front and center is absolutely vital as we analyze these numbers today. Okay, here is our roadmap for today. 1. Defining the poverty condition. 2. Categorizing the poor. 3. Measuring the poverty line. 4. Examining the root causes. And 5. Reviewing government strategies for eradication. Starting off with Section 1, defining the poverty condition. And as we'll see, it is about way more than just income. You see, poverty is a multi-dimensional crisis. It is not just having an empty wallet. It shows up as a total lack of food and chronic malnutrition. It manifests as a severe health crisis with rampant disease and almost zero medical access. It's an education problem where illiteracy basically becomes a life sentence. And it is a shelter problem, lacking a proper permanent house. It creates this vicious cycle, where each of these deprivations just feeds directly into the others. Now, because of this compounding complexity, modern economists have expanded how they look at the problem. Today, they focus on two newer indicators: social exclusion and vulnerability. Social exclusion means the poor are systematically forced to live only in poor surroundings, completely blocked off from the social equality that better-off people enjoy. Vulnerability, on the other hand, is all about risk. Imagine one bad storm completely wiping out everything you own. That is the terrifying reality of vulnerability. It's the high probability that certain marginalized groups will stay poor or fall right back into poverty when external shocks hit, like a flood or a sudden job loss, simply because they don't have a financial safety net. Moving right along to Section 2, categorizing the poor, the chronic versus the transient. When you track income fluctuations over time, you see very different experiences of poverty. In this graph, that straight line represents the poverty line. Now, over on the left, we have the chronic poor. This includes the always poor who constantly stay below that line, and the usually poor who might occasionally earn just a tiny bit more but mostly stay trapped. Then on the right, we have the transient poor. That churning poor graph literally looks like a roller coaster. These are folks like seasonal workers or small farmers whose incomes churn up and down, dragging them in and out of poverty over and over again. Poverty also changes its face drastically depending on where you are. In rural areas, the poor are usually landless, agricultural workers, or marginal farmers who are way too reliant on an unpredictable farming sector. They often fall into these terrible debt traps, borrowing from local moneylenders at just staggering interest rates. On the flip side, the urban poor are often the exact same people who fled those rural villages looking for a better life, but instead, they end up as rickshaw pullers, domestic servants, and low-paid factory workers, living in super vulnerable slum conditions without any vocational training to demand fair wages. Let's look at Section 3, measuring the poverty line, absolute versus relative poverty. First up, we absolutely have to distinguish between absolute and relative poverty. Absolute poverty is a severe deprivation of basic human needs. It measures the sheer number of people living below a minimum standard of consumption required just to stay healthy and be able to work. Relative poverty, though, is basically a measure of societal inequality. It compares the income and assets of people at the very bottom to those at the top, or compares different regions altogether. So you could technically be above the absolute poverty line, but still be relatively poor compared to the rest of your society. But for a developing nation, absolute poverty is the primary urgent thing we have to measure. So how do we do that? Well, estimating absolute poverty in India relies on two main criteria: minimum calorie intake and monthly per capita consumption expenditure. Basically, economists first figure out exactly how much food a person needs just to survive, and then they calculate how much money is actually required to buy that specific amount of food. And that brings us to a really crucial number, 2,400. The minimal calorie intake is fixed at an average of 2,400 calories per person per day in rural areas. But what's really fascinating here is that the requirement for urban dwellers is actually lower. It's set at 2,100 calories. And the reason makes perfect sense when you think about it. Rural life generally demands significantly more hard, manual physical labor, so those folks just need more energy to sustain themselves through a workday. Now, translating those calories into actual money dictates the poverty line. For the period of 2011 to 2012, this was defined as spending just 816 rupees per month for a person in a rural area. For urban areas, it was slightly higher at 1,000 rupees per month. Just think for a second about how shockingly low those monetary amounts really are. If your monthly consumption fell below that tiny threshold, you were officially counted below the poverty line. Which takes us to Section 4, Root Causes of Poverty, the systemic drivers. Because poverty isn't just born from a single event or one bad decision, it is an interlocking web. As you can see here, you have a backwardness in agriculture directly feeding into massive unemployment, which then fuels illiteracy, all surrounding the central node of systemic poverty. To really understand these drivers, we have to look at both history and modern challenges. It historically starts with about 200 years of exploitative colonial rule, which deliberately dismantled thriving local handicraft industries. Then, following independence, India experienced a really stubbornly low economic growth rate until the 1980s. When you combine that slow economic engine with rapid population growth, especially among the poor who often view more children as necessary hands for earning, the per capita income gets severely diluted. Throw in widespread illiteracy, crippling underemployment, and massive inequalities in land and income distribution, and well, you have a perfect storm for nationwide poverty. And that brings us to our final part, Section 5. Government strategies for eradication, action, and intervention. The Indian government's anti-poverty strategy utilizes a massive three-dimensional attack. Step 1 is promoting economic growth, which is that classic idea that a rising tide lifts all boats by creating national opportunities. But we all know growth takes time, so Step 2 involves direct poverty alleviation programs designed to generate immediate self-employment and wage employment. And Step 3 is the provision of minimum basic needs, directly supplying amenities to immediately improve consumption, health, and education. Looking closely at Step 2, those poverty alleviation programs, we see a really fascinating progression over time. In 2000, the PMGY was launched to focus heavily on foundational village infrastructure, things like rural roads, housing, and drinking water. Then, in February of 2006, came MGNRGA. This was huge. It legally guaranteed 100 days of wage employment every single financial year to poor rural households, transferring wages directly to them. And to actually facilitate that economic empowerment, the PMJDY was launched in August 2014, aiming for universal banking access. It allowed millions of unbanked folks to finally open savings accounts, which massively boosted financial inclusion across the entire nation. Now, as someone who practically lives and breathes social welfare administration, this third approach, the provision of minimum basic needs, is where the rubber really meets the road for me. We are talking about directly supplementing consumption, creating employment indirectly, and massively improving health and education through 4 specific, highly targeted schemes. First up is the Public Distribution System, or PDS. This is a mammoth operation supplying essential commodities like wheat, rice, and edible oil to poor families through a nationwide network of nearly 5.5 lakh fair-price shops. Linked directly to the PDS are the Antyodaya Anna Yojana and Annapurna schemes, both rolled out in 2000. AAY provides 35 kilos of food grains to the absolute poorest families at super subsidized rates. We're talking 2 rupees a kilo for wheat and 3 rupees for rice. Meanwhile, the Annapurna scheme provides 10 kilos of free food grains to poor senior citizens, folks 65 and older who aren't already covered under the National Social Assistance Program. But hey, basic needs are more than just a pantry. The Midday Meal Scheme, which launched back on August 15, 1995, serves daily nutritious meals to government school children. And it serves a brilliant dual purpose. It encourages poor parents to actually send their kids to school, boosting attendance, while ensuring proper nutrition to improve their future employability. And finally, the Integrated Child Development Scheme, or ICDS, dating way back to 1975, provides food materials and vital support to mothers and children under 6 to boost food security right from the very start. Which brings us to the end of our analysis, leaving us with a really critical question to chew on. We've seen how deeply entrenched this issue is, right from colonial history all the way down to fluctuating daily realities. As the overall economy continues to grow, will these multidimensional strategies, the guaranteed employment, the massive banking inclusion, and that targeted subsidized food distribution we just talked about, truly be enough to finally break the cycle of systemic poverty in the coming decades? Honestly, it remains one of the most important economic questions of our time. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep seeking to understand the world around you.